Hello, and thank you for coming along. Today we're going to look at African historical cartography, old maps, digital technology leading to new communities and new narratives in African and global history. We're all used to seeing African maps, at least portions of Africa as a continent. Often these are used in textbooks to illustrate things like the slave trade, but rarely are they studied. They're used as illustrations, as kind of generic wallpaper for a period in history. But new technologies now make it possible to look at these maps in great detail in reference to known geological and geographic details, things that we can find out from Google Earth, for example. What's happening is that detailed maps of the slave trade are now becoming a matter of immense interest because they indicate the kinds of things that must have been going on in Africa prior to the departure of slave ships for the New World. These can be laid on top of one another and on top of the Google Earth base and analyzed in reference to those geologic realities underneath them. The result is you can look at new features of Africa, or I should say, age-old features of Africa in a new way, like river basins and deserts, mountains and forests, all of which are rapidly changing in our climate circumstance. If you map some of the historical material on top of these geologic views from space, satellite views, you can learn a great deal, especially if you look at them in detail. That's now become possible. It's become possible because of the digitization revolution. These maps can be digitized and shaped in different ways to fit on geologic substrates, but also they can be blown up and expanded to read details barely legible in smaller sizes, and certainly not available to the general public because these are rare and fragile maps, which few people used to get access to. Now, however, with digitization undertaken in part to conserve these maps, these digitized images can be shared and examined by groups of people never previously having access to them. Take a look, for example, at what is being undertaken in the Africa Map Circle, a group of people internationally that have gotten together to share this kind of information and share their analyses of these maps. They're inspired in part by the work of Professor Gifford, a professor of African history for a long time. He died recently in 2020, but he taught that our understanding of African history, in fact, all history, is shaped by two principal factors. First, the nature of the data we have available to interpret and discuss, and second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle to discuss it, discuss the maps, discuss the documents, and the like. That's crucial. First, the nature of the data. Second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle, as he called it, in the circle to discuss it. That's a key concept. Who's in the circle? Well, the Africa Map Circle is trying to expand the circle beyond those who had access to rare book libraries or map collections of a specialized type to a much broader range of historians, scholars, students, and the general public. The Africa Map Circle seeks to be inclusive, whereas previous collections were by intention exclusive in the sense that you needed to preserve these maps, and that meant that they were kept from the public largely and only displayed in certain occasions and under very controlled conditions. But what is the circle? Well, let's take a look at it. The Africa Map Circle is a very interesting new intellectual enterprise because you could argue that the African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline. It was circumnavigated long before the Americas, or for Australia, for example, or certainly for Asia and large parts of the Russian north, the Siberian plains. But Africa maps were made largely and created by non-Africans. Now, this is an interesting anomaly. The first continent, you could call it that, to be fully encircled and mapped, but mapped by those who weren't from the continent by and large. Therefore, Africa maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the beginning. What are the early maps? Well, in many cases, they're transcriptions of places and names for places that were used in the local language. In other cases, they're names applied from European traditions. But which European tradition? So it depends upon the European group making the map. So there's a hodgepodge of different names, sometimes referring to places, sometimes referring to kingdoms, sometimes referring to names of peoples or associations of peoples or federations of tribes. Other times referring to rather mundane things like salt pans and hard rock. These maps are multicultural to begin with, and they require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. They can't be understood from only one linguistic tradition, for example, nor can they be fully understood if we don't understand what a place name means in the local language. Digital technology now makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. This is what's new. The maps are old, but the technology is allowing us to do new things with them. The result is that the collaborative study of African maps can now provide a new paradigm for international and multicultural teaching and learning. This is very important because the techniques devised here are not just exclusive to Africa. They can be applied to any part of the globe with any linguistic tradition. The study of Chinese maps, for example, could be undertaken in the same way that we're studying now maps in the Africa Map Circle. Study of Arabic maps of Africa, could be included in the same kind of scope, and with great results. Let's see what its intentions are. You might well ask, well, what is it? And you could scan the QR code and find out for yourself. How can it help me? How can it help those I know learn more or teach about Africa? Well, check it out. Scan the code and begin to participate, learn more, and join in. The goals of the Africa Map Circle are pretty simple and can be outlined very quickly. First, to provide readily available public access for scholars and students to historical and contemporary maps of Africa. Second, to provide for educators and students at all levels of teaching and learning resources to use in their own research and their development of online curricula, with selected examples provided from the Africa Map Circle's own Explorations series. And 3, to inspire and encourage scholars and students to expand and extend and share these tools in developing their own online African history research and teaching in Africa, the Americas, in Europe, Asia, and in fact, throughout the world. This is the kind of thing that could facilitate the Chinese study of Africa, the study of Arab countries along the northern part of Africa, and their understanding in their own cartographic tradition of sub-Saharan Africa, their understanding of the Indian Ocean and the role that African traders played in the Indian Ocean. All of these new extensible research areas can be absorbed in what the Africa Map Circle is beginning to undertake. In the future, the Africa Map Circle will seek to provide a platform upon which to share scholarly research and novel instruction initiatives that demonstrate the creative use of maps in online teaching and learning about Africa throughout the world. So, join up, join in. The Africa Map Circle is something for the public in general to learn from and learn about. Under lockdown, which we've all experienced for the last year and a half or so, this has become particularly important because learning under lockdown has changed from the very basic levels of elementary school right up through colleges, universities, and graduate school. Everyone's had to shelter in place and hunker down in a kind of new isolationism. Africa is a huge place, but we didn't learn much about it by going there during the last 18 months. Couldn't go there. Similarly, Africans couldn't come out from the continent and tell us, as they normally have, as exchange students throughout the Western world. That lockdown has meant there's been a kind of cutoff of the usual educational process. But we've devised new tools and developed some tips for online learning about Africa and the world during this lockdown. You can get in touch with some of these through the Africa Map Circle. At the African Studies Association last year, there was a special panel devoted to this. It's called Online Research and Teaching with Africa Maps, Tips, Techniques, Examples, and Resources. And it was put together by the Africa Map Circle, coordinated by them as one of the special sessions. It was highly successful, an international meeting, and in some sense it served as a proof of concept of what could lie in store for an even more ambitious effort. What can it do for students and scholars? Well, take a look at the online research and teaching that we managed to undertake during these lockdown times. Online Research and Teaching with African Maps was a paper presented at the ASA meeting, and you can get access to it by clicking on the resources, scanning in the code, and clicking on the paper citation. So what we're looking at is bringing into a conversation with one another, not just old maps and digital technology, but new communities, plus new narratives in African and global history. How are we doing it? Well, largely through digital communications technology, not just the digitization of individual maps and the ability to send these by email or something like that, but the ability to explore them together with virtual seminar. This is what the African Studies meeting proved last year. We could hold a virtual international seminar with people from all over the world to take part in a Zoom session where things were shared online, real time with one another. Zoom technology is transforming all levels of education, and it's that technology that's being combined now with the digitization of African maps. Let's look at some of the 18th century maps then of the Gambia and Gorée Island area of West Africa. Here's one of the best known ones by a fellow named Leach, Captain John Leach. Developed a map in 1732 of the Gambia River, which was quite detailed. We can take a look at it and demonstrate for you how it can be accessed online and studied by yourselves if you have an internet connection, a cell phone, an iPad, or a computer with an internet connection. Let's take a look at this particular map and also the map of the plan of the island of Gorée, an island right off the coast of Senegal. So let's now take a look through the Africa Map Circle Digital Resources Directory, how we can look at some of these 18th century, 17th century, and 19th century maps of Africa and share them digitally across space and time. There are several libraries you can draw these things from, including the Library of Congress, New York Public Library, Stanford University Libraries, University of Illinois, Northwestern University, and a very valuable private collection entitled Afroterra. Their maps are perhaps the best organized in all of these different libraries. So let's take a look. We'll look for the map by Leach, a cartographer in the 18th century who made a map of the Gambia River that was very influential and quite detailed. So let's search the catalog for his name. Leach, Leach. Okay, we're going to hit go, and sure enough, 3 of the maps that are there are mentioned. One's in French, one's in English. Let's take the English one and take a look at it. If we hit on this, we'll see a small map indicated here in the little upper right-hand corner. Click for high-resolution zoomable image is what it says. And sure enough, we can click that and get out to a zoomable image. And a zoomable image is one that will increase if you pinch it and spread it. And that's what we'll do, is to look at the mouth of the Gambia here and examine what this map records. First of all, let's look at the cartouche. And the cartouche indicates it's a map of the river Gambia from its mouth to Arapina by Captain John Leach, 1732. Now, the cartouche are not photographs. They're iconographic representations, often quite fanciful. Here, for example, we have no idea whether these bow and arrow representations with the person on the left represent real bows and real arrows that were in use at the time, or whether that's just the generic equipment for a native. This is important to focus on because often the images are generic images intended to convey a spirit or an indication of a general cultural type, and often the cultural types are quite wrong. We have no idea, for example, whether elephants existed anywhere near the Gambia at this point, yet they're pictured here in the cartouche. They probably weren't visible and in evidence near settlements in the Gambia. But other things are far more precise and give indications that are quite interesting. You can here see, for example, up these different rivers, indication of Batik, Kingstown, or various functional spots like salt pans. Salt pans over to the left and the right of these different rivulets that lead to the ocean. Then an indication of broken islands. And then some annotations that are really quite interesting and very helpful, like this one. The towns marked with stars belong to the king of Barsali, and the other towns on the island to the king of Bara. These islands and parts adjoining make great quantities of salt and produce most part of the rice used at the factories, the land being low and proper for that grain. Well, this is actually a very interesting piece of information. They're producing rice for the factories. What are the factories? Well, the factories are the European establishments all along the rivers that are gaining slaves and stocking them in this offshore island known as James Island. You can see here's the different factories. Chili factory, Abreda factory, FACT, and they go on up the river. The numbers in the river indicate the fathoms, or the number times 6 is about the number of feet. Fathom is about 6 feet. And here you get an example of an indication of the company's corn house. Now, that means they're storing corn, what they call corn. It's not clear from the map or from the usage of the early 18th century what is meant by corn, except it now seems that it's Indian corn introduced from the Americas. Other portions of this part of West Africa show plantations of Indian corn that are being dried and used and reconstituted in the foodstuffs for the Atlantic trade. Many have focused on the role of James Island. You can't see much from this map because it's in effect so small here, but this is the English fort that's taken over by the English, I should say, during the time of James I, the same King James, for which the King James Version of the Bible is named, by the way. In any case, these are the kinds of details you can pick up from these maps, and they're very valuable assets for looking in detail at what might be called the first draft of archaeology of this area, if we can undertake the archaeology eventually. Let's take a look at the island of Goree as well. Once again, we can go back to the directory in Afroterra and type in the island of Goree, or if we know the map location, as I do in this case, it's map number 1093, and we can go right to it. There too, it comes up in the right-hand upper column square, and you can tap on that and get out to the zoomable map. The zoomable map is very, very detailed and interesting. It has an explanation. Although this is largely a French-dominated island, this map is in English, and the annotations are in English, giving an indication of what is where, all numbered, and an indication of what's supposed to be going on there, including the gardens, which are here, and an interesting set of huts up here, numbered 42 and 43, which are worth investigating in detail. Let's look now at the annotations for 42 and 43. Here they are. 42. Convenient place for huts to lodge ye free Negroes. 43. Huts of ye Bambaras. Now, what are the distinctions of those on the island between the Bambaras and the free Negroes? Very interesting that it should be outlined in a map like this, and something that should be studied in detail, along with the date that this takes place. Indication of a slave booth, as well as where the troops are staying. And then an indication all along here of fortifications that haven't yet been built, but are intended. Fortifications intended. Very interesting. The English are keeping close tabs on this island because they too would like to occupy it. Well, these are the kinds of detailed maps that you can look at and start posing questions more than answering them. These maps are not an answer to the questions we have, but they force us to ask some significant questions of the other documentation available. Well, you can see why we began to think of the use of these maps as taking a step toward an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade, because these maps don't answer so many questions as they pose many, many more. They enable us to look at rivers, coastlines, and islands, and the long ocean voyage in a very different way than we were able to do so prior to access to these maps. And we can raise some troubling questions about how these ships, for example, were provisioned for hundreds of years to travel thousands of miles with millions of hungry passengers. Then we can ask the questions about the major structures left in Africa, constructed for the slave trade out of stone. These are in many cases named after kings. But as one poet put it later on in a very powerful poem, was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? This is the kind of question that can't help but be raised by the close study of these maps and the archaeology of the buildings left in the African coast. We're taking steps towards an archaeology of the Atlantic slave trade. Professor Gifford, as you recall, emphasized that it was first the nature of the data we have available to us and discussed, and secondly, the range of people and perspectives that were included in the circle, as he called it, the circle which exchanged the information and posed the questions, and then tried to answer the questions. Now, the digital revolution has done two things, at least two things, in fact, many more, but it's made it possible to replicate these and distribute them, but it's also made it possible for new groups of people to get together in the circle to discuss them. That raised a whole series of questions that was put by the people who actually were never in the circle before. As you can see, the massive structures built in West Africa didn't build themselves. And often the history books are filled with statements like, the Swedish built this fort in 1650, or the Dutch built this fort in 1685. But anyone who takes a look at this on the ground and on the maps realizes that there are far too many to have ever been built by teams of Swedish workers coming down in boats to Africa, or boatloads of Dutch masons showing up to build a fortress. But no one asked that question. In fact, history books still record that the Dutch built this fort in such and such. Well, when you look at the perspective of these massive structures from the point of view of the workers, the poem by Bertolt Brecht is really very telling. Who built the seven gates of Thebes? As he points out in the second and third line, the books are filled with names of kings. Was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Not quite. This is why who's in the circle to ask the questions about these maps is very important. Professor Gifford's point is crucial. It's true not just of these collections of maps, but of all the archival collections in European hands. The Balliol Historic Collections, a college in Oxford, has decided to expose some of these documents to the public in an exhibit next month, September 2021, entitled Slavery in the Age of Revolution. Consider this exhibit as an example of what one of Oxford's most prestigious colleges is putting forth as a resource for people to understand and enrich their sense of history. They put together a trailer on YouTube about it. There's no argument made in the trailer. It's a video essay, but a kind of invitation to come look at the documents held over the historic period of the slave trade, donated to the college by members of the college, by people who had studied there and have worked throughout the age of slavery. Take a look at their video presentation. The Balliol Historic Collections, Slavery in the Age of Revolution. As you can see, it contains documents about Haiti, forthcoming as an exhibition at Balliol Historic Collection Center in September 2021. Well, this is the kind of digitized material that can now be shared around the world. The presentations of these kinds of historically important maps and documents from libraries, museums, private collections around the world could now be discussed in the Africa Map Circle series of online sessions called Explorations. This is happening already de facto around the world. Here in the United States, these techniques have been extended and entire exhibitions can be presented and later explored on their own by users through interactive online platforms designed in conjunction with the YouTube Exploration series. This occurred, for example, at Harvard not too long ago. There was a group exhibition of the Harvard Hutchins Center History Design Studio, known as HDS, in 2019. They called it Footprints Across Time. It was a group exhibit of 10 different individuals who presented material about the legacy of the slave trade itself, the forerunners of the slave trade, and the impact of slave trade. It was very, very powerful, put together by graduate students with great skill. In this in-person and online exhibit, installations included cartographic narratives from both sides of the Atlantic slave trade system, inspired by the work of Harvard professor Vincent Brown. He's a close friend of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., and Henry Louis Gates attended the opening ceremony and, in fact, endorsed the work. He was quite proud of it. You can get access to that exhibit material because they left up web pages that those who couldn't make it to the exhibit itself can see long afterwards, long through the COVID moment. One of the exhibits was entitled Maps, Stones, and Plants, Agents of Empire and the Ecology of the Atlantic Trade. It had a website to it, which you can get access to quite easily because the feature of this exhibit was that everything within it included a QR code. The QR code was something students knew right away what to do with. Faculty and professors needed to be taught, but you don't need to teach a teenager or a young adult how to use a cell phone. And one of the things they constantly use it for is to scan QR codes. This particular exhibit used that skill already present among high school students, college students, and graduate students, all of whom had cell phones or access to cell phones or iPads. And it used that skill they already have to engage them with documents that were original from the empire days in Africa. Each element in the exhibit included a QR code, which then linked them to the original material and allowed them to study it in detail. You can scan in this QR code and get to the website where that material is available for you to use. In fact, it's a general process going on now in all of galleries, trying to bridge the gap between gallery and reality and back. You can scan in the codes in most art galleries nowadays and get very much richer material than you can possibly pick up or carry while you are seeing the exhibit itself in the museum. Similarly, you can see how it's linked to other historical material, whether that material be from the slave trade period or from the Botticelli moment in Italian and Renaissance art. This is why history in the digital age has become something entirely new, with the communications capabilities of things like Zoom technology and QR codes. Cambridge Community Television used the QR codes, and it made it possible to communicate this material over the television to large numbers of people who could then be invited to see the exhibit. As every high school and college student knows, cell phone technology and instant digital integration through QR codes makes it possible to link in-person exhibits and galleries directly with their wider world across the whole planet. So if you scan in the code from a TV broadcast, or you learn about the Africa Map Circle from a TV broadcast, you can scan in the code. And it's as if you're taking notes on the whole thing and are able to get out to the original material. This is why African historical cartography is much broader in its scope than initially the maps themselves. You can combine maps available from Oxford, from Cambridge, from Harvard, from Yale, all of which have scanned in maps and have very valuable collections of their own, in addition to individual colleges at Oxford or Cambridge. So you can span oceans and bridge traditions to enhance our understanding not only of African history, but all of global ecological history. African history is intimately tied up with the ecological history of the rest of the world for the last 500 years. Since roughly 1492, it was in fact intimately involved long before that through the East African trade in the Indian Ocean and the North African trade and trade routes all the way through the Middle East and into Europe. In fact, it was across North Africa that most of Europe received its culture by way of Arab translations of Greek texts. In any case, these oceans and deserts can be spanned and the traditions can be bridged with the newly available technology. In effect, in Africa, anyone with a video cell phone and access to the internet can now learn about African historical cartography. It may seem amusing to them at first, especially when the European maps are so wrong. Place names, for example, are often mistaken and don't mean what the Europeans were told they meant. This is why some people find it humorous to hear Europeans talk about this, but that's because they have an expertise that neither the Americans nor the Europeans have, namely a knowledge of the local language, which was what the Europeans were trying to encapsulate when they first put labels on these maps. So these individuals have a great deal to laugh about, but also a great deal more to contribute to the study of African history and enrich our understanding of the maps now accessible through things like cell phones. As historical cartography is made more and more accessible to cell phones, it will have the potential to change cultural awareness all around the world, whether in the Western world, in Asia, or in India. This has now become a vehicle for learning about other cultures. African historical cartography is therefore a lot more than just old maps and new digital technology. It's in fact bringing new communities together and new forms of thinking, new narratives in African and global history.